Hi, everybody. My name is Marlene Theodore, and I'm the Assistant Curator of Programs here at the Yale University Art Gallery. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Nancy Boas. Nancy is an art historian, an author, a curator, and the scholar on David Park and Bay Area art. Her book, David Park, A Painter's Life, which you see up here, published by University of California Press in 2012, is the product of 20 years of interviews and research, and it's been hailed as an enlightening biography of one of America's most original artists. We are the happy beneficiaries of this research tonight. Nancy will be speaking about David Park, his influence on Bay Area artists and on figuration in art, and on the Bay Area milieu in which he worked. On a personal note, I was just thrilled to learn that Nancy's also going to be touching on Walter de Maria. That is how vast Park's influence is. De Maria is most known for his work, The Lightning Field. He's who I wrote my dissertation on, and he counts Park among his major influences, so that's very exciting. Following Nancy's talk, she'll be joined by Jock Reynolds, the director of the gallery and the curator of our exhibition, 5 West Coast artists, Bischoff, Diebenkorn, Neri, Park, and Thiebaud, which is on view right now, and if you haven't already seen it, you must. As many of you know, Jock is also a visual artist, and he studied with 2 of these West Coast artists who are on view, Manuel Neri and Wayne Thiebaud at UC Davis. Jock's experience and his knowledge of this period is evident in the exhibition, and I'm sure it will be further drawn out tonight. The exhibition and our collection will be richer for the insight and history Nancy, together with Jock, can offer. We will pass around a mic for those of you who would like to ask questions while they're speaking. After the talk, I know Nancy has kindly brought a few copies of her book on Park, which she's happy to sign for those of you who might like to purchase a copy. And we've set up a table right outside the door, and those books will also be available at Atticus across the street. We are filming this talk, so I'd like to ask that you all silence your cell phones. And now, let me turn this over to Nancy. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene, for that generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to visit the university's magnificent art gallery and celebrate this exhibition of San Francisco Bay Area artists drawn from the museum's holdings. These accomplishments are due to the brilliant vision and prodigious energy of Jock Reynolds. He became acquainted with the artists during his almost 20 years in Northern California, first as a college student and then as an art professor and graduate program director. Jock has mounted a beautiful exhibition of 5 post-war West Coast artists, a testament to his bi-coastal life and his deep understanding of their art. For me, another cause for celebration is the Yale University Art Gallery's acquisition of the model, 1959, a masterpiece by David Park. It is most appropriate that this painting now hangs on the walls of the gallery. Anita Brand Eisner had a discerning eye for art and was an active participant in Connecticut cultural affairs. In 1960, she purchased the model from Park's memorial exhibition at Stempfli Gallery in New York. It hung in her living room in New Haven for 40 years. Those of us who champion the essential role that West Coast painters play in the history of American art are gratified by Jock's enthusiasm for David Park and the painting, The Model. My biography on David Park was published in 2012 by the University of California Press. It was my pleasure to study Park for many years, discovering his significant contributions to art, culture, and art education in the San Francisco Bay Area. This evening, I will give you a flavor of his painting, as well as the colorful art world of which he was a part. I will also discuss his influence on his fellow artists and students, which was felt far beyond his lifetime. After World War II, Abstract Expressionism was the first American art movement to hold the world stage. This famous photograph from life shows most of the New York School painters posed together, including Willem de Kooning, Mark Rothko, and Jackson Pollock. A less-known fact is that abstract expressionism arose in the Bay Area simultaneously and at times in advance of East Coast developments. John Grillo, a veteran and mature student, is considered the first action painter on the West Coast. He created works by throwing paint at his canvases from across the room and painting with gestural abandon. Grillo made his San Francisco paintings before de Kooning's first solo show and as Pollock was just beginning to develop his drip technique. In late 1949, early 1950, David Park, already a respected abstract expressionist painter in San Francisco, gathered all his paintings from his studio and drove them to the dump. Then he embarked on a figurative style that he called pictures and became known as the originator of Bay Area figurative art. Park first exhibited a painting in his new style in March 1950, about the same time Willem de Kooning began his painting Woman One. Few recognized that Park's innovative work marked one of the most important mid-century developments in American art. It also spawned what critic Kenneth Baker says is the San Francisco region's only art movement so far to win global recognition. But I'm skipping ahead. First, I will tell you briefly about Park's early life and give you a sketch of San Francisco's cultural and artistic history in the 1940s and 1950s. David and Lydia Park in 1930. David Park was born in 1911 in Boston, where his father was a well-known Unitarian minister whose family had lived in New England since the days of the Pilgrims. Park left home at 17 and headed out west. He gravitated toward the freedom, outdoor life, and lack of pretensions he found in the San Francisco Bay Area. He was also attracted to its vibrant avant-garde culture. After World War II, San Francisco was an epicenter of new thinking and explorations in the arts, including painting, poetry, dance, and music, especially jazz. Park married at 19, and he and his wife Lydia had two daughters, Natalie and Helen. Park had an illustrious career as a revered teacher in the 1940s at the California School of Fine Arts and in the 1950s at the University of California, Berkeley. To truly understand Park and his relation to both East Coast and Bay Area art movements, one must understand the role of a few significant individuals, as well as the importance of the California School of Fine Arts, today known as the San Francisco Art Institute. San Francisco benefited from the presence of one of the great American museum directors, Grace McCann Morley. She gave some of the major abstract expressionists like Arshile Gorky, Jackson Pollock, and Robert Motherwell their first museum shows at the San Francisco Museum of Art before they received them in New York. Morley also brought to San Francisco the outstanding young curator Douglas McKagy, who after World War II left the museum for the venerable California School of Fine Arts and transformed it into a dynamic institution. Here is a photo of Douglas and Germaine McKagy in the courtyard of the school. Just a second, I'm going to get some water. No, but there are now. As director from 1945 to 1950, McKagy had a clear vision of what the school needed to be when veterans under the GI Bill of Rights were returning from the war to paint and study in its halls. The GI Bill provided free tuition and materials and a monthly living allowance for servicemen to attend art schools as well as universities. The veterans were older than typical art students, and many were serious artists already. This was a unique situation that never before and never since prevailed in American society. The McKagies brought their avant-garde outlook to the Bay Area art world. Germaine McKagie became acting director of the Legion of Honor Museum when the director, Thomas Carr Howe, went to serve in the U.S. Army as one of the monuments men in Europe during World War II. Germaine organized important national exhibitions in San Francisco. They were both in their 20s at this time, which is when this picture was taken, and furthered the careers of local artists. She's renowned for changing museum exhibitions from stodgy, dusty displays into exciting thematic presentations. Another interesting East Coast, West Coast fact is that Germaine McKagie was a student of eminent Harvard art professor Paul Sachs, as was Grace Morley. Sachs's students comprised a national network of distinguished art professionals. Most of the progressive painters in post-war San Francisco taught or studied at the California School of Fine Arts, where they believed that they could be self-sufficient and purposeful without living in New York. Abstract expressionist painting flourished at the school during Douglas McKagie's tenure. It became one of the most innovative art schools in America due to the energy of motivated students who had returned from the war and the presence of a talented group of artist instructors, including David Park, Clifford Still, Richard Diebenkorn, Hassel Smith, and Elmer Bischoff, as well as visiting artist Mark Rothko and Ad Reinhardt. Park taught at California School of Fine Arts from 1945 until 1952. Here is Park at the far left, Hassel Smith and Diebenkorn in the foreground in Park's studio at the California School of Fine Arts. This photo of Mark Rothko, Clifford Still, and Douglas McKagie was taken during Rothko's 1946 visit to San Francisco. Park was an immediate and forthright person, charismatic and charming. He had a ready laugh that shook his whole body. According to Phyllis Diebenkorn, he had an elastic, expressive face that could not hide his feelings and a magnetic enthusiasm that affected those around him. As early as 1946, Park formed 3 important friendships with fellow teachers Hassel Smith and Elmer Bischoff, and with Richard Diebenkorn, then a student and 11 years younger than Park. Diebenkorn took advanced painting and line drawing from Park. They had coffee and talked, and Park soon invited him to his studio. The 4 painters met for lunch most days in Park's studio at the art school, and on weekends at their home studios to critique each other's work. I interviewed Diebenkorn for my book, and he recounted the following. Every Saturday, we would go to the studio of a different one of the 4, and we'd get pretty drunk by the end of the day, but we got a chance to look over each other's work of the month, and there was a lot of talk and sharing of ideas and attitudes. Park's studio, by the way, was up above this classroom on it. Park and Diebenkorn had many things in common. They lived simply and somewhat austerely. They enjoyed socializing with other painters, and they shifted between painting figuratively and non-objectively. They were also both devoted family men. And despite their age difference and the teacher-student relationship, they enjoyed a deeply felt personal friendship that lasted during the 14 years they knew each other until Park's death. Diebenkorn said that Park became his most influential teacher and friend. Diebenkorn also vividly remembered Park's teaching exercises and the influence he had on his own teaching. I'll never forget 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, Harmonium by Wallace Stevens. He read it to us stanza by stanza, and the class drew an exercise for each stanza. He had an endless repertoire of subjects, and each had a flicker of interest, a marvelous thing that sparked you and that you wanted to do. Elmer Bischoff and Hassel Smith in the art school courtyard. The Bay Area art world was unusual in that it was centered on a school, in contrast to New York, where painters like Willem de Kooning and Jackson Pollock gathered in bars, cafeterias, and studios. The figurative group, Park and Diebenkorn especially, lived more domestic lives, and even Clifford Still set a more conservative and restrained example in contrast to the much heavier drinking and carousing by the New York painters. The Cedar Bar in New York. As previously mentioned, the birth of abstract expressionism was not confined to New York City. It was a more diffuse national phenomenon. But because most American critics were New York-based, they interpreted its origins as Manhattan-centric, with the heroes clustered around the Cedar Bar and the Springs in Long Island. The West Coast artists were either ignored, labeled second generation, or provincial by critics. The facts are more complex than that. While abstract expressionism was in the air at the California School of Fine Arts well before Clifford Still arrived in fall 1946, his large, non-objective canvases had a stunning impact on viewers of his 1947 solo show at the Legion of Honor. Despite his imperiousness, Still attracted many students to his classes. Bischoff said that Still's arrival at the art school precipitated a change from what had existed from my first days there, the kind of availability and mutual regard between the faculty members. Still was removed and superior, Bischoff indicated, and his students would come to see themselves as a favorite group, closely connected to the master, a small school within a school. Park and Still offered different aesthetic and philosophical visions. Artist Fred Martin described the atmosphere as two armed camps, the Still camp and the Park camp. The next year, an exhibition of non-objective paintings by Park, Bischoff, and Hassel Smith at the San Francisco Museum of Art aroused further consternation and excitement. Park's canvases in this period grew somewhat larger and his impasto thicker. While Park's non-objective work didn't meet his expectations, and he destroyed most of it, he considered it a necessary step in arriving at his mature figurative style. In March 1950, Park exhibited his first new figurative painting, Rehearsal, at the San Francisco Art Association Spring Annual. And the next year, Park's entry, Kids on Bikes, won a prize in the same spring show. The work was not a return to old modes of realism, for it incorporated abstract expressionist process and gesture, plus Park's innovative concept of space. Park frames his composition by using dramatic cropping, as if looking through a camera lens. He treats positive and negative forms with equal importance and minimizes the cues necessary for visual comprehension. This photo of Park and the one on the book cover were taken by his good friend, the celebrated photographer Imogen Cunningham. Many people perceived Park's move to figuration as a repudiation of abstract expressionism, a defection from the true path. It was a brave and lonely move for him, and for almost 3 years, even his friends didn't understand what he was doing. In fact, his contemporaries were seriously shocked by this work. Diebenkorn famously exclaimed, "My God, what's happened to David?" Finally, in 1953, Elmer Bischoff, and in 1955, Richard Diebenkorn began painting figuratively. Soon, a whole generation of San Francisco artists followed suit, including Theophilus Brown, Paul Wanner, Nathan Oliveira, Manuel Neri, and the slightly younger Joan Brown. Park later told a critic that he felt his new figuration should not be considered the beginning of a separate movement. He called it a divergence from the mainstream, rather than a break or a separation. All the freedom he had gained through his abstract expressionist period is revealed in his figurative work. Elmer Bischoff is celebrated for the atmospheric space of his canvases, achieved through opalescent colors and feathery brushwork. In Bischoff's large 1950s canvas, Orange Sweater, he describes the figure with a burst of warm color that contrasts with the cool background. This is Richard Diebenkorn's Girl Looking at a Landscape, 1957. The force of Park's influence and the experience of the drawing sessions led Diebenkorn to leave his successful non-objective style and begin painting figuratively. Diebenkorn said, "For someone who was intending to continue as an abstract painter, I was clearly consorting with the wrong company." This work demonstrates many characteristics shared by Diebenkorn, Park, and the rest of the figurative group, namely, location of a figure in both indoors and outdoors, high voltage color, and equal treatment of all parts of the canvas. In addition, it was important to Diebenkorn and Park to generalize the face in order to unify the composition and to downplay individuality of the person. In this painting, Diebenkorn downplays individuality by painting the back of the head. The rediscovery of jazz had a tremendous effect on the San Francisco art scene. Artists on both coasts were interested in the Dixieland Jazz revival, but most strongly in San Francisco, where David Park organized the Studio 13 Jazz Band at the California School of Fine Arts. The band was named for the classroom at the school where the group practiced and performed. David Park played the piano, Bischoff the cornet and trumpet, Wally Hedrick the banjo, and in the beginning, McKagie played the drums. The fact that the school's director played in the band gives an idea of the lack of hierarchy that prevailed at the school. The band played primarily New Orleans standards and were revivalist, white players who had learned to play like earlier black musicians by listening to their records and attending performances of the old-timers. Park liked Jelly Roll Morton's two-handed piano style, in which the left hand plays the rhythm and the right hand plays the figures. Park was well-versed in classical music, but he had an almost primal feeling for New Orleans jazz. The band performed around the Bay Area, including in the Berkeley homes of eminent University of California professors who liked to sit in and play jazz with the artists, as here, and at the legendary Fillmore Street apartment of beat artists Wally Hedrick and his wife, Jay DeFeo, who was then working on her monumental plaster artwork, The Rose. This photo was taken in Studio 13 in 1957. David Park plays the piano, his back to us. Elmer Bischoff, leaning against the wall, plays the cornet. In front of him is Wally Hedrick playing the banjo. Joan Brown stands in the shadows at the far left against the wall. The community of visual artists, poets, writers, and musicians was very strong at that time, and jazz was an important connection between the older abstract expressionist and figurative artists and the next generation, the beat and funk artists of the mid-1950s. Park bridged these groups and enjoyed the respect of the younger artists and poets. Wally Hedrick organized the Six Gallery, a famous artist-run cooperative space. There, the poet Allen Ginsberg gave the first full reading of his poem, Howl, a work that came to define the Beat generation. Park took part in several group shows at the Sixth Gallery, whose members thought that the participation of Park, Bischoff, and Diebenkorn added respectability and attracted critical attention. The Sixth Gallery was preceded in its Fillmore Street space by the King Ubu Gallery, founded by the poet Robert Duncan and his partner, the painter Jess. Park had his most extensive solo show of 1953 at the King Ubu Gallery. Now I'd like to show you several additional images to give you a flavor of Park's art as it developed over the years. Girl in Woods is one of Park's surprisingly accomplished juvenile paintings done when he was just 12 years old. This work shows that his interest in painting people in nature began early. Park's love of thick pigment is already evident. The buildup of form through color and the unity of figure and field are important ingredients of his compositions, even in his youth, although his post-impressionist approach, seen here, would soon change. Park worked in a number of styles during the 1930s as he sought to find his own approach. In Boston Common, 1935, which is painted with tempera on canvas, Park depicts figures in a social realist style and blends them with spatial concepts inspired by pre-Renaissance art. He creates a pyramid of children of different races playing in a park, and behind them, a topsy-turvy array of Boston buildings. His use of an assortment of skin colors and a non-rational perspective became notable characteristics of Park's work. Encounter, circa 1946, is an example of Park's work when he joined the faculty at the California School of Fine Arts. It's stylized and abstracted and shows Park's interest in reciprocal forms, where you can see either one form or the other, but not both at the same time. This balancing of positive and negative elements shows Park's effort to integrate figures with the abstract painting field. Rehearsal was the first new figurative painting Park exhibited. The subject is the Studio 13 jazz band. Note the downward perspective and the snapshot-like framing similar to Degas. Park uses an abrupt, asymmetrical cropping to create a fragmented view, emphasizing the open piano that takes up nearly half the canvas. All the figures but one turn their backs to us. Park's defiance of some abstract expressionist dogma led him to create compositions that seemed to break the picture plane. Yet he did accept the abstract expressionist precept that the space of the painting should extend beyond the edge of the canvas, suggesting boundlessness. Sometimes this is achieved by creating partially cut off forms at the edge of the canvas. Here, the edge forms are the ear of the pianist on the left and the figure of the bass player on the right. Portrait of Hassel Smith, 1951. Park had a remarkable way of capturing a subject's essence. Here he uses edgy colors to portray Hassel as brash and cantankerous, with his ruddy complexion and red hair, his audacious Hawaiian shirt, and his enormous hand, almost in our face, gesturing with a cigarette. The Red Hat, 1954-1955. Park would tell his students, paint the whole world red, or paint the whole world blue. He was speaking not only of the desire to unify boundless space in a painting, but also he was echoing paintings like Matisse's The Red Studio. Park had seen this great painting, which unifies the surface with a single color, in 1938 at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. In Park's red hat, the color red falls on different surfaces as an abstract field, while still characterizing the female figure. Interestingly, the red hat is owned by artist Wayne Thiebaud, one of the artists featured in the Yale exhibition. A word about Thiebaud. He lived and taught in Sacramento, California from 1951 until 1960, with occasional New York stays. Although he was not part of the original Bay Area figurative development, by the late 1950s, he was familiar with the Bay Area figurative artists and formed friendships with most of them. His work echoed their aesthetic preferences for thick paint and vivid color, but expressed a different, more lighthearted sensibility. His earlier work emphasized still lifes of food and, in recent decades, imaginary and fanciful landscapes of Northern California. The dailiness of life was an ongoing theme in Park's paintings from 1950 to 1955. They have as subjects the commonplace contemporary world he lived in, but his deeper purpose was to engage the spectator in an experience of vision and participation. Each canvas seems composed to surprise and to subvert the expected view, such as Girl at Fence, 1953. The trick Park plays on the viewer is similar to Bonnard's in works like The Breakfast Room. Here, the figure of a woman is barely perceptible on the left against the background, but finally we notice her. In the park, our attention is drawn to the flowers, and slowly we recognize the fence and then the figure. In Ball Game at the Beach, 1951, the head of the foreground figure is obscured by a volleyball. Park creates an in-your-face composition that appears to break the picture plane. Critic Sanford Schwartz, writing in a 1985 New Yorker, describes this painting like a photo from life crossed with a Maori carving. The boy is naturalistically drawn, and our viewpoint is so close to his upraised arms and the ball he holds that we feel we're with him, and that the stick figures in the distance might be in his imagination. In Boy and Car, 1955, Park frames the image with the roof of the car and the boy's exaggerated forearm and hands. Art historian Milton Brown said that Park had a fully formed vision when he changed to figuration. His distinctive way of seeing and painting was a snapshot view of reality, a close-up view of reality, all very personal to him. Without photography, we would never see like this. Park never painted from a model, only from visual memory and his imagination, but he enjoyed drawing from a model with his circle of friends. During the 1950s, Park, Bischoff, Diebenkorn, and James Weeks participated in weekly drawing sessions in Berkeley. Sometimes they were joined by their colleagues Paul Wanner, Nathan Oliveira, and Theophilus Brown, who are considered the bridge generation. They hired a model and made sketches. They would spread their completed drawings on the floor and discuss them together. The drawing sessions were a welcome contrast to painting alone in the studio and became a ritual that continued with a changing group of artists for years after Park's death. Joan Brown and her second husband, Manuel Neri, were younger than Park and Bischoff and members of the second generation of Bay Area figurative artists. Although Brown claimed her teacher Elmer Bischoff as her mentor, her work most closely resembles that of David Park's in its thick impasto and funkiness. In a conversation with Neri, Brown defined the term funk by declaring, "It's David's work. That's funky. Neri's sculpture at that time embodied the Bay Area figurative aesthetic, using raw plaster and oil paint to create forms in 3 dimensions in the same spirit that his colleagues created on canvas. Girl with Long Braid. Park joined the art department of the University of California in 1955, and he taught there until his death in 1960. Among the students who revered Park as a teacher and mentor was the sculptor and land artist Walter de Maria, best known as the creator of the lightning field. De Maria remembered Park as the most outstanding teacher in the department because he was the freest spirit. In the 50s, the pressure to be an abstract painter was so strong, de Maria said. De Maria recalled one in-class demonstration. Park took a wide brush, moved his forearm, wrist, and fingers rhythmically to complete the stroke. In a few minutes, the nude model looking back over a chair appeared on the student's brown butcher paper drawing. His mature style was so sure, I would never forget that act of creation. His blank paper was now a work of art. Interestingly, when I visited de Maria in his New York studio, he had only one painting hanging on the wall, Girl with Long Braid. De Maria also said, I believe Park had a similar influence on painters and teachers in California as Willem de Kooning had to the painters and teachers in New York City. Both men influenced through their work and the strength of their character and personality. Park sought to inculcate in his students his own free and undogmatic approach. All things that are being done, he would say, had to begin with someone's lonely discovery of them. Paint what's really exciting to you. More things can happen on a canvas than all the critics have yet dreamed of. Park never let himself be ruled by critics. The critic who mattered was himself. In 1955 and beyond, Park focused less on portraying everyday scenes and moved toward uniting figure, ground, and brushstroke into a painterly whole. Canoe, 1957. The theme of boats was constant in Park's work from his childhood until his final gouaches. The 2 canoers inhabit a world created by a thickly painted field of color and movement. The fall of light makes this quite abstract work appear more representational than it actually is. Park had an exceptional ability to give the eye just enough information to make the image hold together. Women in a Landscape, 1958. In this painting, featuring 2 women of different skin tones, is another instance of Park incorporating ethnicity into his work. Park felt a deep kinship with humankind through the ages, and he believed in the validity of art in all cultures. Park put a kind of power into works like this because he didn't want anything sweet or pretty in his painting. Elmer Bischoff said to me during an interview, I'm always amazed by the tenderness of the light and color in Park's work, and then the brutality of the form. Park painted portraits from a mental image, not observation. In Portrait of Anne, 1957, he presents the figure against a colorful field that seems to run boundlessly beyond the frame. The orange light hitting the face is like a mask. In fact, Park often used masks in his painting. Here, it may symbolize the younger Anne and the older Anne. Boy with Wallet, 1957. The brush strokes and treatment of highlights in this painting of a young boy show David Park at his expressive and painterly best. There isn't a drawn line in this work. The painter captures the figure's absorption and concentrated focus, and in this way invites the viewer's attention. Park created many empathetic scenes of childhood, and the young boys in his paintings often resemble himself as a child. Park conceived of figures and the natural world as a spatial unity. That is, he transformed abstract expressionism's unbounded spaces and non-objectivity to suggest the space of the natural world in which humans exist. He insisted on painting people, even though at the time it was contrary to the dominant rules of abstract expressionism. Park saw human beings as inseparable from the natural world, anticipating the environmental movement to come. Woman and Coffee Pot, 1958, is another painting that deals with spatial unity, this time a figure embedded in a beautifully brushed, non-objective field. Park gives equal treatment to the entire surface. This painting was illustrated in Life in 1962. The caption remarked on the painter's ability to monumentalize everyday acts. The bather became Park's favorite subject. Red Bather, 1958, shows us the new post-war American, sportive, informal, and close to nature. The surf is like a Japanese print, and the sea surrounding the figure resembles an abstract painting. David Park was the acknowledged leader of the California School of Fine Arts until Clyfford Still arrived in 1946. As previously mentioned, the two strong personalities became leaders of rival camps at the school. Despite their disagreements, Park's late paintings harbor an affinity for Clyfford Still's work, such as 1949A, number 1. Park's figure almost dissolves into dark and light until what stands out is the vertical highlight edging an arm or torso. These two paintings share a similar palette, as well as floating shapes that make the space ambiguous. Another comparison is between Park's Four Women, 1959, and Still's Untitled, 1952. In both these monumental paintings, forms run parallel to the picture plane, as in a frieze, and the space between the forms is activated by jagged verticals. Park's painting is almost like a figurative version of Still's work. But in searching for what was meaningful, Park went beyond the influence, inserting a human presence into Still's non-objective universe. Park's reputation as a painter became truly national when art dealer George Stempfli inaugurated his New York gallery with a solo show of Park's work in September 1959, the year before his death. Here is the catalog cover for the exhibition, which shows the painting Nude Green. The show resulted in reviews in major magazines and newspapers and entry into important public and private collections. Interestingly, the characterization of Park and Still as opposite poles continued in a 1959 Time article on David Park, The Image and the Void. The article describes Park's painting in San Francisco as a significant new offshoot of abstract expressionism that welcomes figures back into art. The Model, 1959. Park used his summer vacation to turn out canvases in preparation for his exhibition. He wrote Stempfli, "I managed to get about 12 hours of painting in daily, get violently upset, scrape tons of paint off, feel a terrible embarrassment about going to the store for another enormous order of colors. There will be some things to show you." He also mentioned that he was keeping 3 of his favorite recent paintings, The Model and 2 others, to submit to the Ford Foundation competition 3 weeks before his Stempfli show. Describing The Model in his letter, Park offered a rare look into his method of painting. I worked violently. That large, unresolved canvas that had a white female and a brown male got itself tortured into every conceivable variation. It has ended up revealing a model, female, on the left, and an easel with a painting, rather influenced by Park, on the right. Next to his signature on the letter, Park drew a hand with crossed fingers and the admonition, "Don't relax." Park's discussion of how he radically changed the subject of the model counters the notion that he tended to work from a preconceived idea. He worked in an exploratory way, following forms where they might lead, creating on the canvas a complex play on multiple points of view. The painting's monumental size, thickly pigmented surface, and superbly plotted color all contribute to Park's convincing translation of how a painter sees. Standing by a window, the nude model turns back slightly toward the unseen painter, her pose differing from the straight-on view of the painting within the painting. The unseen participant, the painter, stands outside the canvas in the same space as ours, implying our interchangeability. More directly than most of Park's paintings, the model takes the world of art as its subject and carries art historical references to Velázquez's Las Meninas and Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, among other works. The woman's face in the model appears to be a demoiselle-like mask of red and black. During recovery from a back operation, when he was too weak to paint in oil, Park turned to colored felt tip pens on paper and executed his remarkable scroll, a 30-foot-long continuous composition on shelf paper. Park learned in May 1960 that he had terminal cancer. He decided to refuse treatment, return home, and paint as long as he could. He began his last works, his transcendent gouaches, in colors as brilliant as stained glass. He turned out about 100 gouaches in 2 months. These gouaches were Park's final great effort, reprising earlier themes he had once painted in oil. After Park's death at the age of 49, his work gained even greater appreciation nationally. Today, his art is collected vigorously and can be viewed in distinguished museums around the country. In the growing monumentality of Park's late work, Diebenkorn noted the successful integration of his values and his art. He would want to live up to his ideals, more so than anybody I can think of. He wanted to live what he preached, that is, the breadth of handling, the retreat from detail, the emotional grip on an idea. These are the things that came into his late work. As reflected in Woman and Child, Park's paintings are the pictorial embodiment of his values. He celebrated everyday life as the highest good, and everyday man and woman as heroic. Park said, "I think of painting, in fact all the arts, as a sort of extension of human life. The very same things that we value most, the ideals of humanity, are the properties of the arts. The words that come to mind are many: energy, wisdom, courage, delight, humor, sympathy, gentleness, honesty, peace, freedom. I believe most artists are goaded by a vision of making their work vivid and alive with such qualities." Park lived by these values to the very end. His life and work provide one of the inspiring stories that illuminate American art. Thank you.
Wonderful. Terrific. Congratulations. Oh, wonderful. Thanks. Come on up, Will.
Okay, all right.
Can I bring you another water along the way?
That's me, thank you.
It does start to, why don't you sit right here?
Okay.
Start to illuminate a different sense of history than many people often have of the Bay Area and how it relates to New York. I mean, I was educated by a number of these people. I grew up in this era, and I always felt, frankly, an incredible generosity from the teachers I had. And one of the things you made very evident in this talk about Park, there was an incredible work ethic amongst all these artists. They were working all of the time. The fact that Park did, that many gouaches toward the end of his life, or they went every week to, just draw from the model. These people were always working. Frankly, in the Bay Area at that time, also, there was very little in a way of market at all. I remember
Yes.
Wayne Thiebaud, for example, was shown in the Hanson Fuller Gallery, and he's my teacher at Davis. And back in those days, Wanda Hanson was just telling me last week that she could barely sell a painting of his for $75 or $100. At some point, she got desperate enough, she'd take her station wagon to supermarkets and lower the tailgate and try to sell them there due to the food subjects. So one of the, and Alan and Wayne finally went to New York and sat on the stairs of the Allen Stone Gallery until Alan at the end of each day would have to trip over him in order to say, look at my slides. They later finally became great friends. One thing I never understood, though, and I hope you could illuminate this, is how did Stempfli ever decide to start showing some of this work? What connection did he and dealers like Alan Frumkin and others make, but particularly Stempfli, who not only showed Park, but others, and even showed my teacher, Bill Wiley, who was a second generation, because that same thing started to happen in the Bay Area once there were more viable commercial galleries. How did that get going?
It got going because Robert, the curator of the Museum of Modern Art, who went then to the Metropolitan Museum, became interested in David Park, and his name is Robert.
Well,
Anyway.
anyone know who the Met?
No,
No?
same period, but he was a curator of
Larry, you worked there. Come on.
I have it in my book.
Yeah.
But anyway, it will come to me later, and I'll tell you. But he had seen Park's work, and he said to Stempfli, "You have to go to California and see David Park's work." Mm-hmm. And so Stempfli came. Stempfli was just opening a gallery in New York. He had had other international experiences.
Yeah.
And had come from Texas, but he was opening a kind of Park Avenue gallery in the place where Park Burnett is now, was, and is no longer. Yeah. But in any case, David Park was very generous to the other painters and introduced Stempfli to several of them. He didn't meet Bischoff on the first trip, but he did meet Diebenkorn and Joan Brown, and he took, he went to see J. DeFeo, who was working on the Rose, and J. DeFeo took him through a little door to a studio where there was Joan Brown. Mm-hmm. Working covered with paint. She was about 21 years old and totally covered with paint. And she was not even interested in selling anything to Stempfli. She was not interested in showing paintings in New York. But but it was quite a wonderful opportunity for Park. And Stempfli was a great dealer for Park. He only knew him a year and a half before Park died, but they had a great friendship, and Stempfli picked, 8 paintings the first time, 10 paintings the next time, and the model was one of the paintings that Stempfli bought. And he had such a wonderful eye. He had his choice of all these wonderful paintings, and he picked really good ones. So.
Another thing you brought up, and I think is very interesting, was the fact that Kagi's wife, Germaine, and Morley were students of Paul Sachs, and they were in these positions as women in a very prominent role in the Bay Area when they were still in their 20s. One of the things we have been trying to do at the gallery here is give back that kind of sense of privilege to really be involved with this collection and do things here at the gallery when people are very young. And I think many people who studied Sachs as students always felt that so many of them at a very young age went out into the world, became museum directors and curators. And I don't think many people ever thought about how those two women got to those positions in San Francisco. Tell us about that. And were they Radcliffe students who migrated into his Harvard classes? How did they get how did they get into that cadre of students in the first place?
Well, Morley came for a summer school. She studied at a summer school, and Germaine McKagie went to school in the Midwest at Case Western, and which was just called Case, I think, at the time. And but then she went for graduate school to Harvard. To Douglas McKagie was really well educated, but Germaine was even more well educated. They were both of them very lots of fun and very lively and very learned. But I was very interested to notice when you see the shows that they put on, that there was a kind of network that you're not aware of. You see the shows that were given, but if you look closely, you'll see that, like, Peggy Guggenheim was in correspondence with Grace Morley. Grace Morley took a lot of Peggy Guggenheim's work or shows. And so even though San Francisco seemed very far away, it really was very close because of this network, I think.
How about...
and also, I would just say that Germaine McKagie was allowed to become the director of the California Palace of the Legion of Honor because all the men were at war. And that's how she got to have that job.
Yeah, I'd have to tell you, the one painting we need to buy next for this collection is a really great early Joan Brown painting, because when she's at her figurative strongest with thick impasto, very strong brushstrokes, boy, there's no one better. And the same is also true that you had women artists there and women in major positions of museum leadership and curatorship that was really quite unlike almost any other city at that time when I think of some of those people. And they were treated just very much as equal peers when you think about it at the time. Would you say that's true or not?
Absolutely. And of course, the force of their personalities.
Yeah.
Joan Brown was younger,
Yeah.
but she did attract a lot of attention as a student.
Yeah.
And as you were saying earlier, when we spoke earlier, Claire Falkenstein was also an important person who had an international career and taught at the school.
I think it's really interesting right now that we have Moline having worked with our young students to create this show upstairs, Jazz Lives, in which we see, again, the tradition of jazz music in relationship to these artists, but also the tradition that exists in jazz music in particular. We've seen it now in a couple of our weekend conferences and concerts, that people who mastered those musical forms really felt an obligation to teach it and pass it on to others in a very, very generous way, often with no sense that you were going to pay even for a lesson or anything. You were just brought in, and there was an obligation to teach the next generation. And I have to say that was one of the things that, growing up in California, being taught by people like this and having exemplars like them. And I went to school with Hassel Smith's son, Joseph, with Elmer Bischoff's son, John. We were the next generation out of those families. There was a sense that the people teaching us immediately took us seriously, wanted to help us, and in many cases advanced us literally into their own galleries, into shows, offering us jobs when none of us, frankly, had a clue of what to do when we were basically getting out of school, to tell you the truth. We didn't know how we were going to make a living or do anything. And so when people talk to me, well, how did you start 80 Langton Street in these alternative spaces? You make it very clear that Gallery Ubu, Gallery 6, these were the kinds of alternative spaces our teachers did even before we then did it years later with much more help from the National Endowment and the kind of blossoming of that scene later. So the precedence of that kind of generosity and artists taking a certain self-determination to create their work, share it with each other, was very grassroots determined and with virtually no marketplace. As you say,
Yes.
Joan didn't even care to, a lot of people didn't even want to sell her stuff.
Wally Hedrick and Jay DeFeo were invited to be in an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. They were in the exhibition, and in the catalog, they did not go to the show. It was a huge, it made a big difference. But there was really a collegiality among students and teachers, and especially after the war. The students had seen combat, and they had seen more experiences than some of the professors, and there really wasn't a hierarchy there. And the teachers, the students, the teachers were artists first. That made a big difference too. They weren't exactly professional art teachers. They were devoted art teachers, but they took their own art very seriously, and so you had such good examples, such good models that the students were motivated to.
Great. Rather than us keep talking, we've got some really interesting people in this audience. Let's get a microphone around, raise a few hands, and ask some questions. Valerie, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to know for you, Nancy, what was the spark that led you on this 20-year journey of working on this book and David's life?
Thank you. It was a little bit serendipity. I had always admired David Park as an important painter, and I had finished my book about the Society of Six, and I wanted to do a project of someone who was in the Bay Area, so I didn't have to go to Paris to do my research. So, and I just thought I knew I would spend a long time, and I thought David Park was just such a wonderful painter, and his life was complete. Biographers, you miss something if you don't know the person, and I didn't, but you do have the complete life which to work on. So, and his family, and also his family and his friends were just extremely cooperative and willing, and they were also articulate, that it was a pleasure to interview each of them, and both the professors of English at Berkeley or of rhetoric or the artists, and Diebenkorn was his feeling made him very articulate.
Yeah. Does anyone out there from the East Coast ever heard of the Society of Six? Oh, we got 2 or 3 hands here, but you spent time in California though, right? So there was even another whole generation of artists even before that. There have been these different schools or groups of artists that tended to inspire one another, because I remember the Segrist, there were that whole, do you want to just say a word about what they did just before this happened? That's another very interesting.
Yes. Well, that was another sort of serendipitous thing. I think that my subjects find me, but anyway, I went to the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and there was a survey that Henry Hopkins had done of 75 years of California art, and here were these 6 or 8 little paintings, marvelous, bright, post-impressionist color, and they were places like Point Richmond or locations in the Bay Area, but interpreted in a very free and wonderful way. Small paintings, but sort of built together. And I was just so excited about them, and they had been pretty much forgotten. There had been an exhibition in 1972 of them, but anyway, I went and a friend of mine and I started, and we interviewed there was only one member of the 6. Lou Segrist was the only living member of the 6 when I started that, and they were really a great group who painted in isolation, and the Panama Pacific Exposition showed them the world of art, and they wanted to be impressionists, which they weren't exactly, but they had their own vitality and their own kind of...
And they did really unusual things. Not only did they work out of doors, often from in a plein air almost tradition, but they mixed sand and grit and dirt. They mixed all kinds of wild stuff into their paintings. So part of what I think a lot of us always felt was some of that sense of impasto that later also came into play in the Bay Area was there in the thickness of what they had done to augment paint and process, although the subject matter was different. These were things you just sort of saw as a student looking at these generational changes in the Bay Area. Even at that time, it wasn't easy to get to the East Coast. I couldn't afford a ticket for about 10 years, so and there was no internet, so you weren't necessarily seeing that much elsewhere. You were feeding off what was somewhat your regional art, except for those who could travel.
Well, but yes, that's true.
At least for us youngsters.
Yes, but but I do want to say that in balancing that was the fact that many important exhibitions came to San Francisco.
That's true.
And so actually, Morley put on shows. When I said they were before they were in New York, they were 10 years before they were shows in New York.
Yeah.
So she was quite ahead of the curve, and I know that Diebenkorn and even Clifford Still did not like the idea that people said, oh, well, there was a kind of mythology in the East that the Bay Area painters had not seen anything real, that they had seen pictures in the newspapers, like black and white. And of course, Diebenkorn had seen everything he was in the Army, so he saw, all the work in Washington and New York and during the war years. So they were quite sophisticated in terms of what they had seen, even though travel was hard.
Yeah. Another question? Yeah. Here you go. Here's a mic for you.
I want to congratulate you for being one of the very, very few writers that has made a point of improvisation and invention being right at the center of Bay Area painting. This is something else they took from abstract expressionism. Mm-hmm. The other thing, there was direct contact between a lot of the West Coast painters, or some of them, and the East Coast painters. Theophilus Brown was very close to the Diebenkorns and Roscoe, the Roscoes. Thiebaud was close to Franz Klein. But and Brown actually was doing figurative painting when he arrived in San Francisco.
Yes.
One question, the park abstract paintings.
Yes.
They're popping up regularly now in the galleries and so forth, his non-objective paintings. Brown and Paul Warner were both very, very insistent that David Park wanted all of those destroyed and would be horrified if he saw what was happening today.
There are only 5 non-objective paintings.
Well, and the abstract paintings.
I mean, abstract. There are only 5 abstract paintings, or I call them non-objective, that exist. So when you see 5 of them, that's a lot. But and the ones that survived, 2 of them belonged to Bischoff. Elmer already owned them, so Park couldn't take them and destroy them. And
think of his work ethic and imagine how many went to the dump.
a lot of them went to the dump.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting to see some more, but I don't. There are only 5.
Yeah.
I thought Hackett Mill did an entire exhibit of them.
I don't think so.
No.
I want to mention also, a younger generation of curator who was coming up at the time, Jim Dimitrian, who was actually in Southern California, was the assistant to Walter Hopps at the Pasadena Museum, and later went to the Des Moines and then at the Hirshhorn. He's someone I've always venerated as a great museum director for his love of the object, of the work, regardless of where it came from. And I'm very convinced that when I met Jim, just leaving Des Moines to go to the Hirshhorn and saw how he installed the Hirshhorn collection, was the first time I'd ever seen someone install a national collection with a sense of how it all worked together. It was just extraordinary to see. And he was also, and I'm convinced some of this came from the understanding of what he had seen in the Bay Area, these artists. He knew them, he loved their work. He was one of the first people to also look at and buy and support Lucian Freud and Bacon when basically no one in America was paying attention, way, way back, and purchased that work. And Hugh Davies showed the Bacon Popes in San Diego, I don't know, 30-some years ago. You know, the credit for that kind of stuff just does not percolate, has never percolated very accurately into history. And, you know, over time, some of that gets cured. But, you know, your book and a lot of what you had to say really should make a lot of people look more carefully at these things and not think that the artwork is so monolithic or, you know, centric to one particular place. I think you made that very beautifully apparent in your research.
I hope so. Walter Hopps was who worked with Jim Dimitri, had such a wonderful eye, and he was a very young person when he became he was a curator when he was still in college. Yeah. He was so precocious, but he really appreciated the important people and could pick them out like that.
Yeah, and he came, as you know, to be at the Corcoran, then the Menil. So a lot of people moved around too, which is another interesting aspect. Yes. Anyone else out there? Let's take maybe one more question, and then we'll let you get out there and have some refreshments. And anyone else? How about anyone from the Eisner family? You've come here and you've seen this wonderful painting. Do you want to say anything about it and any happiness in have it show up here now after all these years? Here we go. Larry.
Thank you. To Nancy, I would like you to talk a little more about David. You're talking about artists, and one of the things that impressed me so much in your book towards the end is the character of this person who had something within him to say, I know the world will disapprove of this completely, and I'll be ostracized, maybe, but I have to do this. And there was something that's very compelling that we were talking about in your book, how he grew up in Boston, this old line family, split and went to California, but there was something that was continuing in him that gave him some of the substance to be able to do something that was very unpopular at the time.
Yes, Larry, that's a point that is meaningful to you, and it's meaningful to me. And it's part of the secret of the effect that Park had, the effect that he had on Diebenkorn, the effect he had on Walter de Maria. It was his character and was his sureness of sort of, he was modest, he was funny, but he was also sure, and he didn't have to be he walked to his own drummer.
Great.
And
thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nancy.
thank you.